I have looked forward to it. Glad this time that my wife Judy is here with me, and she wasn't able to come last time, but she too was looking forward to coming back because she had done a ladies' day and years gone by here and really enjoyed that, and looking forward to coming back and seeing you again. So it's just great to be here. It really is, and I thank you so much for the opportunity and invitation to come back again, and looking forward to our time together. We are going to do several things throughout the few days that we're here, but primarily we're going to deal with the subject of revival. I think revival is so important for all of us because we tend to ebb and flow in our spirituality, and every now and then we need to see how important it is to be revived again. I'm reminded of a little story I read one time that said way off in a remote area many years ago, they used to have a revival gospel meeting every spring. And it said that there was one guy that lived in the community, an older guy, that kind of went through the same pattern every time. Usually the first service of the meeting, he would come in, he'd sit on the back row. And then the next service, he'd move up a few pews, and eventually he'd end up on the front, and he would always ask them to pray for him that he would be filled with the spirit of renewal again. So he did that, and then the next year he did the same thing, then the next year he did the same thing, and then about the fourth year, he did the same thing again. And when he got up and asked everyone to please pray that God will bless me to have spiritual renewal in my life, there was an older sister that's sitting back there and said, "Be careful, Lord, because he leaks." Well, I think the truth is we all leak to some degree. And we need to be revived every now and then, and how important that is for us all. There's a passage that is recorded back in Psalm 85, and most of you that are familiar with the Psalms, you know that they deal with different things. And in the 85th Psalm, we learned that apparently God's people had come back to their homeland again. They'd been off in captivity. But while they were there, they picked up some of the ways of the foreigners. Not only that, they were proud to get back home again, but unfortunately, while they were there, they were far more concerned about doing their own things, like building their own houses and such like, than they were in building the house of God. So the psalmist writes in Psalm 85 and verse 6, "Will you, Lord, revive us again?" There's some things that we need to consider here. When I used to see that, and I thought, well, there's a passage on revival, but it's more than that. If you think about it, apparently they had been revived at some time, because he's not saying revive us, he's saying do it again. So we all need to be revived again, because we all tend to leak every now and then. If I were to bring, if I had brought a balloon in here this morning that was inflated with helium, I started to do that, but I thought, well, some folks might not like that. But anyway, if I were to bring one, and you know what would happen, if I turned it loose, what happens, Jeff? It goes straight up. And you say, well, Stan, you know it's high in here. Why in the world would you do something like that? How are you going to get it down? Well, if I let it stay there long enough, it'll come down by itself. And so that's the way it is for you and me too, because there again, we all tend to leak. In Revelation chapter 2, we learn about the church at Ephesus. And you remember that there are a lot of other passages, like the book of Ephesus, and other things in the book of Acts that we read about Ephesus, and probably no church of the New Testament had more advantages and had more nurturing than did the church at Ephesus. But it's interesting, when we get to chapter 2 of Revelation, we learn that this is one of the later books of the New Testament, and God said that you guys are doing some good things, and there's some good things about you, but there's one thing that I have against you. He said you've lost your first love. In other words, you're leaking. That spirituality that you once had is no longer there. You're leaking out. You're becoming complacent. You're becoming people that are lukewarm. Didn't call them lukewarm here. We learned about that a little later on, but didn't call them that here, but pretty much the same idea. And God said, unless you repent of where you are, then I'm going to have your candlestick removed. In other words, I'm not going to allow you to continue on as a congregation, because you're going to have to repent of where you are. There again, we learned that there were some folks that had leaked, and they needed reviving again. So that's where we're going here in the next couple of days, to think about revival. What I want us to do this morning is to ask ourselves where we are. And in this Bible class, I want you to just answer. You don't have to tell me, but I want you to just think to yourself, where am I spiritually? This morning, as you think about your own life, and just be honest with yourself, you don't have to tell me, you might fool me. God knows you can't fool God, and really you can't fool yourself. Well, you can, but you have to work at it. So I don't want you to try to fool yourself. I want you to be honest. Are you spiritually elated here this morning? And by that, I don't mean just being in Bible class. I mean before you came to church. I mean yesterday. I mean day before yesterday. I'm talking about this past week. Talking about this past month. I'm talking about this year. Where are you spiritually? Are you spiritually elated, or are you spiritually deflated? Have you leaked out? Which one of these would more describe where you are, if you're honest with yourself right now? That you really feel like that you are spiritually elated, that things are going well with you, you feel good about your relationship with God? Or do you feel deflated, that you feel like your energy, spiritual energy, has just been zapped? Do you feel like that really, I'm going through the motion, but I really don't feel it? A few years ago, I was preaching in a gospel meeting, and at the end, in fact, my text that night was assigned, was Revelation chapter 2, 1 through 7. It was a letter addressed to the church at Ephesus. And that night, I made the same kind of appeal to them, and I said, look, God says, I expect you to be fervent for me. I expect you to be people that are on fire for me. And I said, a lot of times we might attend church service time after time. We might not miss. We might be here every time the doors are open. But it may be that we're really not here. When we sang the invitation song that night, there was a gentleman, I would assume, that probably was about 60 years old, that responded to the invitation. And he came forward and he came down on the front pew, and there were a couple of others that came down too. And I'd known this guy for quite a long time. Of course, I was visiting elsewhere, and he was not a member of the church where I was preaching. But I remember I took his confession. He said, Stan, let me tell you something. I need those coals of fire again. He said, because I no longer am even simmering for the Lord. He said, I'm just cold. He said, I haven't missed a church service, and I don't know, probably years. But he said, I haven't been here, my heart hasn't been here in a long, long time. So he was spiritually deflated. I'm asking you, where are you? You might say, I'm somewhere in between. That's not good enough. We're either on fire for the Lord, or we really are not serving Him very well at all and not pleasing to Him, because God expects us to be enthusiastic. What does enthusiasm mean? You ever thought about what that word means? It's antheos, which means God within, or God in us. And when we are enthusiastic, we're talking about God being in us. That doesn't mean that we have to jump pews. It doesn't mean that we always have a smile on our face, but we always have one on our hearts. And it means that we can have a good, positive outlook on life, and we feel good about our spiritual lives. We feel good about the church. We feel good about what we are in this world because of what Jesus has done for us. That's when we are spiritually elated. But when we lose that, then we become spiritually deflated. There's a verse that I want you to know, and some of you probably will already, but it's recorded in Romans chapter 12 in verse 11. Now, I've got two versions up here. Both are very similar, but just for clarity, I wanted to point out both. But Paul here is giving several admonitions of what he wanted Christians to be. First of all, in the New King James Version, it says, I don't want you lagging in diligence, but fervent in spirit, serving the Lord. The NIV, I like the way it puts it in this because it says it more in everyday terms and doesn't do any disservice to the particular text when it says, never be lacking in zeal. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. So I want you and me to realize that God expects us to ever be spiritually keep our fervor in spirit, and also that we are never to be lacking in our enthusiasm, our zeal for serving the Lord. Now, what I want us to do in the balance of our time this morning is to get more specific. Kind of laid out where we're headed generally in the next couple of days. But I want us to think about this. What are some things that drain that spiritual energy? As I call it, the uns, and every one of these will begin with an un, and that's the reason it's emphasized as it is here. 5 things that undo our spiritual fervor. Number 1, an unbalanced schedule. I don't know what your calendar looks like at home, but if you're like most families, you probably got one on your refrigerator or somewhere there close. We call that the communication center of the family. And so we keep all of our notes, and we keep all of our doctor's appointments, and we keep all this and that on that particular calendar. We've got one, actually ours is around to the side of ours, but we got one of these, and it seems like it's ever getting booked up. Even at my office, I'll look a couple of weeks ahead, and I think, wow, boy, I've got a clean week there. But boy, as it gets closer, it's amazing how that calendar fills up all of a sudden with all kinds of things. An unbalanced schedule zaps us of our spiritual energy. Now, let me be real up close and personal here for just a minute. You know, the truth is, when it comes to gospel meeting time, when it comes to revival time, I'm using those interchangeably, or when it just comes to worship time, we ought to look forward to it. We ought to be excited because what are we after all? We're Christians. What does that mean? We belong to Christ. And it means that our goal in life is to put God above all else. And we ought to look forward to that time when we can come together and worship Him. And then we think about a gospel meeting, we think, whew, that's 4 days. And if we're really honest, maybe not true with everyone, but we're really honest, some folks are just kind of dread it. You know why? Because it just adds an extra burden to a schedule that is already so booked up. And we think, well, I'm sure it'll be good. But man, I'm just not so sure I'm looking forward to it. You see, when our schedule is unbalanced, that's the way it is. We just endure. We just kind of put one foot in front of the other and just endure things rather than enjoy the things that we really ought to. In Luke chapter 10, the end of that chapter, you remember that Jesus went into the house of his good friends, Martha and Mary and Lazarus. And on this occasion, we learn that there were disciples that were with him and they were hungry. You remember the story. They go in, they were invited in fact, and Martha, as we always find her in the New Testament, always somebody that's serving, and nothing wrong with that. I like servants. I like to see folks that are busy for the Lord. Martha was busy, but she forgot why she was busy on this occasion. And remember that she is in the kitchen, and she's trying to get the meal prepared for Jesus and those disciples. And remember, Mary, the sister, though, decided that she wanted to sit in and listen to Jesus, and she's sitting at his feet. And it's always been a point of fascination to me that Martha comes in, and rather than speaking to Mary, she speaks to Jesus and says, Jesus, and I'll paraphrase here, tell my sister to get in herself in the kitchen and help me. Because I'm cumbered with all this serving, and she's sitting in here doing nothing. You remember Jesus' response? Martha, Martha, you are worried and cumbered about with much serving. But listen, Mary has chosen what? The better part. Now, it wasn't that Martha was doing something wrong, but she forgot why she was doing it. And so she was so busy thinking, I've got to get this done because I've got to do this afternoon, and this is coming tonight. And maybe her schedule was a little unbalanced to where she forgot that she was serving the Lord. And she forgot that I can enjoy this. And she forgot the joy of entertaining. And she forgot the joy of hospitality because she was so burdened with so many things that they just seemed to drift away. When you and I get so busy with things in life that we forget the most important things, then we're too busy. I have learned as a minister, it's not always easy. I know how it is with us preachers. Sometimes we have trouble saying no. And when I say that, I don't mean to just engagements that might take me away from killing, but I'm talking about things that might take me away from family. And I'm talking about things that keep me from doing the most important things. So what I try to do, I'm not perfect at it for sure, but I've learned to say no every once in a while. And I've learned that even sometimes I have to say no to some pretty good things so that I can say yes to some better things. And you and I need to learn that if we haven't yet. Sometimes it's all right to say no, not just because we're lazy, but it's okay to say no because there may be something more important that we really need to do. If our schedule is so unbalanced that we've lost the joy of serving the Lord, then we're just too busy. Sociologists say that we will be known as the generation that tried to do too much. And as I think about the lives of people and talking with young married folks and how busy they are with their kids, whether it be travel ball whatever it might be that they're involved with, then I see them, they're just parents that are worn out all the time. I see kids that are kind of frazzled too, as much energy as they might have, because they've let their schedules get unbalanced. But where it's really taking its toll is on their spiritual well-being. Because you see, I might see them at church once or twice a month, because they're gone the rest of the time. They're doing this and they're doing that. And it's not they're doing all bad things, but sometimes they neglect their spiritual well-being. And as a result of that, they've just become too busy. Again, the question for you and me, how does your schedule look? Are you so burdened with all the things that you've got to do in life that your spiritual life is suffering as a result of it? If that is the case, then we've learned, number one, that this is a problem when it comes to saying spiritually fervent for the Lord. Number two, unconfessed sin can also drain our spirituality. In Psalm 32, there is one of the penitent psalms of David. Probably everyone in here knows the story of what David did as far as the sin in his life. You say, well, I remember back in 2 Samuel 11 that he committed adultery with Bathsheba. That's exactly right. And then we learned that he had her husband Uriah murdered because he tried to cover it up. And then we learned that there was about a year's time that David didn't come clean with the Lord. That had gone on. It was unconfessed. It was something that David knew better than to do, but David had never made it right until a year later. And then we learned that after he finally repented and made his life right, we have these two Psalms, 32 and 51, where David is showing his penitence. In Psalm 32, he said, when I kept silent, before I ever confessed my sin, when I kept silent, he said, my bones ache within me through my groaning all day long. Night and day, the Lord's hand was heavy on me. I felt guilty, he said. And now listen to this. And my vitality was turned into the drought of summer. When we harbor sin in our lives, we can't expect our spirituality to be much. In fact, it would just continue to be suppressed and would be continually pushed down, because if there are things that we need to make right in our lives will never be what they ought to be until we come clean with God and even ourselves. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 23, you remember Jesus said, when you come to worship, he said, when you bring your gift to the altar, and remember that you have a brother, that something exists between the two of you and you haven't made things right yet, he said, don't go ahead and worship. He said, just stop what you're doing right there, leave your gift, go and make things right with your brother, and then come back and worship me. There again, these kind of things that need to be resolved in our lives, this unconfessed sin, things that we have yet to deal with. Now, I'm going to make you a little uncomfortable for just a minute. But I've got to bring this up because it's so true. It's the world in which we live. I do a lot of counseling. I'm not a licensed counselor, but it comes with the territory. And what I'm learning, especially in this day and time, is that the sins that people deal with the most, I'm talking about Christians now, the sins that Christians are dealing with the most are those that are most easily concealed of the things that we might do. In other words, they're things that we can kind of do in private because of the world in which we live. I know some folks that have problems with gambling. But you see, a lot of folks wouldn't know about that because they don't have to go out to some casino to do it. They do it on the computer at home. Now, I know some folks that are head over heels in debt right now, losing their families right now because they've become so enamored and addicted to gambling. But yet, it's not something they felt that they would ever get caught doing because they can do it in the privacy of their own homes. Do you know what the fastest growing addiction in America is right now? It's pornography. But you see, you don't have to go out. Or you can, but you don't have to. You don't have to go out and find it somewhere. You don't have to buy the magazines. You don't have to go to the clubs, etc. Because you've got the computer right there at home. And a lot of folks, I see it every week in the paper, pretty often, dealing with Christians within the church. Confess, I've got a real problem in this area, and I'm not so sure how I'm supposed to get out of it. But there again, it's become such a problem in their lives. Did you know that most affairs, over half of affairs right now, are at least Facebook related? Because folks have looked up an old friend. It may be a woman, it may be a man. We find it both ways. And they start things, and it leads to other things, which leads to bad things. There again, not something that's so known to everybody always, but you can't fool God. When we think that we are hiding this and we're the only person in the world that knows, we're the most deceived person of all. Because there's always somebody that knows. And certainly God always knows. Unconfessed sin. 1 John 1 and verse 8. If we say that we have no sins, we deceive ourselves, and the truth is not in us. But if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. When you and I have sins that we're harboring in our lives, we'll never have much in spirituality. In fact, we'll continue to go on down the drain until finally we say, I've got a problem, I've got sins that I've got to get out of my life. And although it may not be generally known, I've got to be honest enough in myself to say I've got sins that I'm going to have to deal with and confess those sins and get out of them. When we don't, our enthusiasm, our spiritual fervor is going to be drained, and it will continue to go downhill until we come clean with ourselves and God. Next, unresolved conflict. Unresolved conflict. This may be true in many areas, but let me mention just a couple. Remember that sometimes when we live in family life, and we do that in church, and I'm not, if this is going on, let me just say right up front, I don't know about it here, okay? So I don't have some ulterior motive in saying this. I just know God's people. But sometimes, even in the church, there can be disagreements. And sometimes a little more than just a little disagreement. Sometimes we say things, we do things deliberately and undeliberately that really hurt somebody else. And when those things happen, it can cause such a stir. Because we're human beings, and although God tells us not to do this, rather than going to that person, which we ought to do, what Jesus said we are to do, Matthew 18, usually rather than going to them, we go to everybody else. And we tell them how somebody's hurt my feelings, or what somebody did, or what somebody said, and here we go. In Ephesians chapter 4, Paul said, I don't want you to let the sun go down your wrath. He begins that by saying, be angry and sin not. The first part is easy. The second part is difficult. Everybody can get angry. But to not take it to a sin level is really a challenge indeed. Then the next part of that, and I think verse 27 fits into that too, nor give opportunity to the devil. Anytime we don't resolve a conflict in a timely fashion, and we let the sun go down on the wrath, it just opens a door for Satan to step right in, because he'll take advantage of your anger, he'll take advantage of your resentment, he'll take advantage of you in any way that you'll let him do. So here we learn then that unresolved conflict is something that can cause a major problem with our spirituality. Now I want to ask you something, and I emphasize this. Just want you to be honest with yourself. As you look around here this morning, they might not be here yet, But as you think about this church family, is there somebody that you need to forgive? You might say, well, no, but there's somebody sure needs to make things right with me. No, that's your problem just as well as it is theirs, if you haven't done anything about it. Well, the Bible says, well, I know what the Bible says. If somebody offends you, then you make sure that they come to you. No, that isn't right. If someone offends you, it says, Matthew 18:15 and following, then you go to them. Doesn't say get on the phone. Doesn't say get on Facebook. It doesn't say call everybody up that you can think about or call everybody to the side that'll listen to you. It says if somebody has a problem with you, then you go to them. You might say, well, I did that. They didn't do. If you did that, then you've done all you can do. Paul says in Romans 12, as much as is within you, live peaceably with all men. You do your part, and it doesn't matter what they do. I hope it gets right, and you do too. But even if it doesn't solve things with them, you can live with yourself and thinking, well, I've done all I know to do, and I did it honestly, and then you move on. Don't let it be something that remains a fester in your life. You move on and say, I pray that things will be worked out. I pray that things will somehow get resolved in time, but I don't know what else to do. I've done everything that I know to do. But if you ever come to church and you avoid somebody because you just don't want to talk to them, or you hope that they sit on one side because you're going to sit on the other, or you hope that you don't get out of the car at the same time in the parking lot and you're close to each other because it might make it awkward, then there's something you need to do. You need to make it right. You need to make your part right. You can't control what they do, but you need to make your part right. And when you have this unresolved conflict within the family, your spirituality is going to be drained. In fact, you will get so off-centered, you'll forget about what you really need to be doing because that so occupies your life, you tend to forget about those things that are important. So unresolved conflict, anger, resentment, jealousy, we don't talk about those much in the church. We just read through them usually. But God talks about them a lot because He knows we're human beings. And He said, if you've got this unresolved conflict in your life, you need to get rid of it. Number one, because it's sin. Number two, you'll never grow spiritually and be enthusiastic about serving the Lord until you make things right in your own life. Next, when we untie ourselves from spiritual friendships. It's been said, and I think it's probably right. And when someone is converted, someone new comes into the church family, it's usually pretty hard for them to break into the local fellowship. Why? Let me tell you the difference, and I know if I brought this up before, but I probably need to do it again. I didn't need to be reminded every once in a while. Let me tell you the difference in what I call the country church and the city church as far as the dynamic of the fellowship is concerned. When we have the more rural congregations where everybody's related to everybody, that's not always a bad thing. But if somebody comes into that fellowship or someone's converted into Christ and they start worshiping there, it's very hard for them to break in. You know why? Not that families don't want them to be a part, but we take care of one another. We fulfill the needs of one another. And so we're not as in tune to their needs because we're so used to taking care of the needs of one another. And this person is dangling around out here and he feels like he's trying to get in a door, but everyone is locked. There again, we don't necessarily intentionally do that. It's just that we do unless we're conscious of it and make an effort to pull them in. Sometimes we sit back and say, well, if they want to come, they can. No, we need to pull them in. A city church, on the other hand, does not have so many family ties. They're made up usually of an eclectic group that come from different parts of the country because of work or such like. And so as a result of that, not so many family connections. And they're far more in tune to somebody new coming in because they were new at one time too. And they know how they felt, and they realize how important it is to reach out to those folks and bring them in. How many times have you heard, I know this morning in a Sunday morning Bible class, I'm talking to a lot of folks who have been in church for a long time. How many times have you heard somebody said, I'm not going back there, not coming back there. I just don't fit. Now, you can't make somebody fit. I know there are two sides to this. But you can do your part. You can do your part. So, friendships are important, and here's the point. If someone comes into a congregation and they can develop at least 4 to 5 good friends, more than likely they're going to stay. Now, there again, you can't make them become a friend with somebody, but you can at least give them a chance. If a new person makes 4 or 5 good friendships within that congregation, they will stay. Any less than that, there's a very slim possibility that they're going to remain with that congregation. In Ecclesiastes chapter 4, remember Solomon said, 2 are better than 1, for they have great reward for their work. And he goes on to explain how that if one falls down, the other can help them get up. 2 in a bed on a cold night, they keep each other warm. And then if an attacker comes against one, 2 can fend off an attacker far better than 1. And then he said a 3-fold cord is not easily broken. Solomon is talking about the value of friendships, but how true that is with God's people. We need one another. Over and over and over again in the New Testament do we find those one another passages. We are to love one another. We are to pray for one another. We are to be hospitable to one another. We are to serve one another, and on we go. The one another's. But when we untie, and when we don't find that kind of connection within the local body, then our spirituality is going to wane. Now let me ask you something again. Where do you have your greatest friendships? Are they with God's people? Probably in Bible class, more than likely. But where do you find your greatest comfort level? Do you find more comfort in being with God's people or with Satan's bunch out in the world? Where is your greatest comfort level? Be honest. Where is it? When we untie and we do not allow ourselves to be engaged in the local fellowship, then we can expect our spirituality to wane. Several years ago, we were in another state, and I started out right out of college as a youth minister. Really wasn't where my heart was. It was great. I enjoyed that year, but I really wanted to do pulpit work. I just felt that that's where my talents really resided. And so I after a year, went on into full-time pulpit work. But during that time, I made a lot of good friendships within the church, and a lot of good young couples that worked with me, and we just had a great time. And I went on to do the full-time work for several years, and then that same congregation invited me to come back and to work with them. When I went back, there were certain folks, naturally, because I've been away from them for a while and had such good rapport with before, I wanted to see and look forward to being back with them again. And one of those couples was absent. And I thought, well, maybe they're just out of town when I first got back, but 2 or 3 services went by, and I hadn't seen them. So finally I asked, and they were so active in the church there at one point. I said, where are he and she? Well, Brother Stan, it's a sad thing. For whatever reason, they decided that they had some friends that like to ride motorcycles, and so they bought one too. That's not anything wrong with that. That's just a neutral thing, but I'm just telling you what happened in this story. And it happened that the motorcycles are just kind of the victim of the circumstance. And they started riding motorcycles with those people that they started associating with. And then she saw that this is not good, because a lot of these guys get together and they ride on Sundays. And we already have a commitment to the Lord. We're going to be with Him on Sunday. But as time went on, they developed deeper friendships. It caused a problem with them. He started going out and riding with those friends on Sunday. She was going to church, but it was a problem between them. It wasn't very long until he quit the church. It wasn't very long after that until they got a divorce. And it wasn't long after that until she quit the church. And to my knowledge, still is unfaithful to the Lord to this day, and that was years ago. But if they had just stayed tied to those good Christian friendships and not given those up, I don't know that they would have ever lost their spirituality. But you and I both are in trouble when we do. So untied from spiritual friendships or relationships will cause us to lose our spirituality. Finally today, unclear direction in life. Unclear direction in life. If you get to where you're going right now, where are you going to be? That's a pretty good question, isn't it? If you end up on the road where you're traveling right now, where are you going to end up at the end? I want to tell you that my goal is heaven. And I would imagine for this Bible class that there are many in here that would say the same thing, that that's number one with me. If I end up at heaven, that's my ultimate destiny. That's where I want to be. But I want to ask you, is that really the way your life is going? Are you really directed in that, or oriented in that fashion? A lot of people are losing their spirituality because they're just floundering. You ever find yourself floundering? You know what floundering is. It just means you're kind of here, there, and everywhere, and you're not really making progress, and you really don't know what's going to happen, and you're really just kind of in limbo. Are you floundering spiritually? Are you just kind of flopping around? Or do you have real direction in your life? Last week, I'm sure it was here, just like it was at home, when the remnants of the hurricane came through. Thankfully, it had slowed down its winds a lot when it came to us. But anyway, pretty cool there for a couple of days. And on both my vehicles, the tire pressure warning light came on. You know how it is when it warms up and cools down and such like. You get those and you know that, well, they've lost. There are a couple of options that I had. I could have said, they look all right to me. You know, look like most tires look, and I just looked at them. Now they're fine, I believe. Or I can fix them. I opted for number two. I was busy, but yet I thought this is important. Those Michelin tires are expensive. And I want those tires to keep on running as long as they'll run. So I went outside and I got my garage and I hooked up my air compressor and I got out the hose and I got my little gauge and I checked them and sure enough they were off and nothing wrong with the indicator. It was dead on. They both needed some air. And I fixed them and the light went off and I feel good about that. But I'm sure the time's going to come that I'll have to put more air in them because that's just kind of the way it works. And that brings us full circle to where we have talked here this morning. It may be that if you're just astute enough to look, maybe your warning light has come on too, not on your car, but in your heart. And saying, I have deflated. I have leaked down. Things have changed in my life, and I've got problems. You know, life is like that. Don't we all go through some difficult times in life? Who hasn't? If you've never gone through a difficult time in your life, raise your hand. I'd like to talk to you. I'd like to know what that's like. And I'd like to commend you for it. But you see, every week, I deal with folks. In fact, there were 2 couples last week going through divorce. I've never found a good divorce yet. And it takes a toll on the lives of those that go through it. I'm talking about the most innocent. It takes a toll on their spirituality. I see folks all the time that are still struggling because they've lost their husband or their wife, or they've lost a child, or they lost mom and daddy. And they're still struggling with that because it's hard and they're in grief. I talk with folks that have lost their jobs. I talked to a guy just the other night. He said, I thought I'd have this job for life. And all of a sudden it was gone. He said, man, it's so devastating to think, what in the world am I going to do from here? Life is not fair, and life is rough on everybody. And because of those changes in our lives, it would cause the pressure to go out too of our spirituality. But we can make the one of two choices too. We can ignore it and say, well, it's probably just about like everybody else's life. Or we can choose to fix it. My challenge to you as we close here in this class, what are you going to do about yours? I pray that things are going well with you. But I know that we all are a little like this in life. And sometimes we're feeling good about where we are spiritually, and other times we need revival. God, revive me again. And we sing that song rather fervently, revive us again, and may God revive us because we all need it. God bless you.